Imagine a lake with one lily pad, and after every day at this lake, each lily pad reproduces, creating another lily pad. If after 30 days, all the surface of the lake is covered by lily pads, which will be the day that the lake will have half of its surface covered by lily pads? Stop the video for a second to think if you need. If you think this day is gonna be the day 15, you definitely don't understand exponential growth. If you think it's after the 15th, but can't define with the given data, you also don't fully understand exponential growth. Well, but don't worry, the coronavirus epidemic showed that actually most of people don't understand a thing about it. My name is Mauricio Fel, engineer and PhD candidate in particle physics working with data analysis, and today we'll talk about a problem of exponential growth. Now going back to day 1 of the lake story. After a day, the lily pad generated another one. After the second day, each lily pad reproduces and now we have 4. After another day, we will have 8. Then we have 16, and so on. Now let's say we don't want the lake to be filled with lily pads. What's the last day that can take an action before it's too late? You probably already deduced that this must depend on the amount of lily pads I can remove per day, right? Now, suppose this number is 50 lily pads per day. In the first day we had 1 lily pad, then 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 lily pads. Note that, even in this moment, I take 50 away, there will be 14 lily pads left. And then in the next day, we will have 28. But if I take 50 away from here, it falls to 14, then the next day doubles to 28, and if I take 50 again, there won't be any left. But note that, if I wait for the next day, when I have 128 lily pads, from this day on, I can no longer avoid the lake filling with lily pads. If I take 50 from this day, there will be 78 left. But in the next day, I will have double, which is 156. And then if I take 50 again, it will be 106 left. And as one can see, regardless of taking 50 lily pads away per day, it keeps growing. And after this point, the point of no return, we can no longer prevent the lake from becoming full of lily pads. So note that it doesn't matter how much of the lake is already covered by lily pads. From the moment the reproduction rate of the lily pads surpasses my removal rate, this is the moment I lost the battle. And because of that, what is important is to observe when the reproduction rate is getting closer to the removal rate, and not to the lake capacity. For this reason, in situations like this, we should not wait for the lily pads to reach a certain proportion of the lake, like half for example. But instead, we need to act before the number of lily pads reaches our removal capacity of lily pads. So, it doesn't matter how much of the lake is filled. What really matters is how close the number of lily pads is to our removal capacity. And if we observe how the total number of lily pads in the lake evolves, we will see that it follows an exponential curve. The number of lily pads doubles every day, 2, 4, 8, and so on until the 30th, when we have 1 billion lily pads. And for this reason, if we want to prevent the lake from being fully covered, doesn't matter how many % of the lake is currently covered. What matters is how many we can remove and how fast the lily pads are reproducing. So, even if we could remove 100,000 per day, the point of no return would be around day 16, where way less than 1% of the lake is already covered. And from this moment, even though less than 1% of the lake is covered, the complete coverage is basically unavoidable. And then, there's no way you can avoid this sudden growth in the end of the exponential curve. And if we bring this to the context of infectious diseases, we will see that it behaves in a very similar way. If we have one person infected, after a certain amount of time, this one will infect another one, and we will have two infected. And after another certain amount of time, these two will infect other two, and I will have 4 infected, and so on exponentially. And now, obviously, there are many factors that our lily pad example differs from an infectious disease. And I won't risk talking about because I'm not an epidemiologist, but I know that the beginning of every epidemic starts exponentially. And if nothing is done to reduce the infectious rate, to reduce the number of people each individual infects per amount of time, this will grow exponentially until we are close to the population limit. And then there won't be people left to be affected, and the curve will flatten. But differently from the case of the lily pads, we can actually slow down the curve with mitigation measures, like washing your hands, social distances, and quarantines. But the goal of this video is not to talk about epidemics. The goal of this video is to show how exponential growth doesn't look very logical to our brains. And also to show that what matters is not how much of the lake is filled, but instead the growth rate of the curve. Note that on the 24th, less than 2% of the lake was occupied. So on the first 24 days, less than 2% was occupied. But in the next 6 days, the remaining 98% will be fully occupied. So if you want to act to prevent that, we need to act early, way before we get to the 2% of the lake. We need to act when it still doesn't look like it's a problem at all. And going back to the initial question, if in a lake there is one lily pad, and each day this lily pad reproduces creating another one, and on the 30th, all the lake is covered by lily pads, the day that the lake will have half of its surface covered is actually the previous day. It's on the 29th, which on the exponential curve will be exactly here, midway to the top, but almost all the way to the right on the 29th. With that said, I hope it's clear the importance of listening to the experts who knows how this curve works and who can model the exponential growth, and also how important it is to observe those numbers while they're still low, because after a certain moment there is nothing else to be done. So, if you can, for those who can't, stay at home. And in my opinion, even more important, listen to science. Thank you. And a little remark about the ending. I originally made this video with Brazil's case in mind, so when I say for those who can stay at home, I refer to the millions of people that can't simply stop working, otherwise there won't be food for their families. But if you're like me and live in a rich nation, and especially if you can't afford to stay home for a few weeks, for fuck's sake, stay at home. And please listen to science. Thank you.